Hey everyone, if you've switched across to using Azure Bicep for your infrastructure as code with Azure, and you're still using the JSON-based parameter files, well, there is great news for you today, or this week rather, because with the latest version of Azure Bicep, it is now supported to use Bicep param files, which allows you to write your parameter files natively in the Bicep language. So in this video, let's jump in and we'll take a look at the features and the functionality that are available here in the first generally available release of Bicep param files. Okay, we're over here in Visual Studio Code, and I've got a few Bicep files there that we'll take a look at in just a moment, but I do want to pause and point out that to use this Bicep param functionality, you do need to be running version 0.18 of Azure Bicep or newer, otherwise you won't have this functionality exposed to you. So here I've got the Azure Bicep CLI installed. So if I do a Bicep --version, you can see right here, I am indeed running version 0.18.4 of the Bicep CLI. And similarly, I've got the Azure the Azure CLI installed as well. And if I do an AZ Bicep version, you'll see that I also am running the version 0.18 of Bicep there in the Azure CLI. Now, there's a few things that isn't quite working with the Azure CLI as of right now, but I'm sure the team is working on that, and probably by the time you watch this video, those commands will work. But they do work with the native Bicep CLI, just not the Azure Bicep, the AZ Bicep CLI version. Now, I've also got the Azure PowerShell tools installed, and here in Visual Studio Code, if I jump across to extensions and just do a search for Bicep, I have also got the Bicep extension installed. If I just get rid of the terminal there, and you'll see that I've got this installed. And again, as of right now, if we look up the top here, it is version 0.18.4. So that's important for some of the functionality that I'm going to show you here in Visual Studio Code as well. So with that out of the way, I'm going to jump straight into it. So let's go back to Explorer here. And I just want to show you a couple of Bicep files that I've got in this folder structure. It's nothing too complex. I don't want to focus too much on the Bicep itself because I want to show you the parameter files. So here under modules, I've got a resource group directory, and then there's a Bicep template, which is doing a pretty standard deployment of a resource group here. I'm not even going to go through these parameters because I'm calling them from a different Bicep file, which you'll see in just a moment. And similarly, under storage account, I've got a storage account Bicep file, which again is doing a pretty stock standard deployment of a storage account. Again, the resources themselves aren't too important, and that's not what I want to really focus on here. So what I've got is I've got a deploy-environment.bicep file. And if I get rid of that on the side to get some more screen real estate, what I do want to go through here are some of the parameters. So towards the top, I've got a parameter called environment code, which is a string and it's defaulting to dev. And then for this one, I've got some allowed values up here. So this parameter could be set to either dev, test, or prod. The next parameter down is the location, which is being set to a string. And again, I've got some allowed locations, so I can deploy to Australia East, Southeast Asia, or East US too. The next one down is a parameter for tags. And this one is an object, and it defaults to being an empty object, so that is optional. So the ones up above were required. Actually, that's not specifically true because I've got a default there for the environment code. So let's change that across to optional while we're here. And if I scroll down just a little bit more, then we've got one more parameter down here on line 21, which is whether to deploy storage or not. So I've got a Boolean there, obviously true or false, as to whether to deploy a storage account. And then down here, I've got a variable that I'm setting, which is for the storage account name. And I'm using a function in here to use or to grab or to generate a unique string based off the subscription ID. And that's going to be important for our parameter files or our Bicep parameter files because I'm going to move that out into the parameter file a little bit later on. So just keep in the back of your mind for now that I am generating the storage account name in the Bicep file right now as a variable, but we will move that out a little later on. Next down here, I'm setting the target scope to the subscription because I'm deploying a resource group. So this Bicep deployment needs to be targeted at a subscription. And then I'm just using modules here. So the first module is deploying a resource group using that resource group.bicep template. And then I'm using some of the parameters that we've passed in. So we've got Environment code here is making the name of the resource group, and we're passing through the location and the tags from parameters through to that module as values. And then down here a little bit further, again, another module to go ahead and deploy the storage account. Over there on the right-hand side, I do have a condition. So if that Boolean for deploy storage account was true, then it will go ahead and deploy the storage account. If it was false, it won't deploy the storage account. And that's all I've got. I don't want this to take too long. Like I said, I don't want to get bogged too much down in the Bicep itself. I want to show you the Bicep param files. So with that said, if I come across here into the Explorer, how can you go ahead and create a Bicep parameter file? And there's a few ways to do it. You can just go ahead and start with nothing and create a new file here. So let me go ahead and just say, we'll call this one parameters dot. Now the extension here that you need for Bicep parameter files is bicep and then param at the end. And you'll notice there that that little icon on the left-hand side, you see the little bicep icon there? It is got the brackets around it to indicate that that is a bicep parameter file, rather than this one up here, which is the standard bicep file itself. So there is a distinction there between bicep param and .bicep. Now let me go ahead and close down the Explorer there on the left-hand side. And you'll notice immediately this file isn't happy. We've got an error there and a red squiggly line with the bicep param file. If I go ahead and hover over that, it tells me that a using declaration must be present in this parameters file. What a using declaration is we are going to tell this bicep parameter file which bicep file that it is associated with. And that's so it can do a lot of the validation as we go through here and put in our values for our parameters. So if I just go ahead here and type using, which is the first keyword that we can use in bicep param files, I then need to give it the path of the bicep file that I'm going to associate this parameter file with. That's a little bit different to what you're probably used to with JSON-based parameter files, because you don't directly associate it with an ARM template or a bicep file. So I'll go ahead and associate it with my deploy-environment.bicep file. But again, something's not happy here. And if I hover over that, it tells me that the following parameters are declared in the bicep file, but they're missing an assignment in the parameters file. So this is doing real-time validation against the bicep file to make sure that as we author this parameter file, that we've got the right values in here. So let's go ahead and I'll enter down a couple of lines. The only other keyword that is available today in a bicep param file is the param keyword. So this is how we define each of the parameters. So I'll say param, and we will go with environment code to start with. And then I'll put an equals sign and then give it the value. And notice there, it's automatically already popped up and said, do you want it to be dev, test, or prod? And that's because it's doing validation against my allowed values over here. Remember here for this parameter of environment code, I had allowed values of dev, test, or prod. So if I come back over to here and I do something else like UAT, for example, this is not going to be happy. And if I hover over it, it says that environment code expects a value of dev, test, or prod, but the provided value is UAT. So we're getting that real-time validation as we author these bicep parameter files, something that you've probably been very used to if you've been authoring bicep itself. And it's really awesome to see this here in bicep param files as well. So I'm going to go ahead and set that to dev for now. And we need a few other parameters. So what else have we got? We'll do the location and we'll set that to Australia East. And the next one was for deploy storage. I'm just going to set that to false for now. And then we had one that was optional, which was tags. But let's go ahead, and it knows that it's going to be an object. So I'll choose that in there. But let's put some tags in. Let's go with, actually, I want to show you that you can reference other parameter values here in line. So let's go with environment for the name of the tag. And for the value, I can reference one of these other parameters here. So I'm going to say environment code, and that looks good there. And then I'll put another tag in, say deployed with, and we'll put a string for IAC so that we know that these resources have been deployed with infrastructure as code. With that said, that is the bicep parameter file. So that is creating it from scratch, just creating a .bicep param file, defining the using statement to tell it which bicep file that you're going to associate this parameter file with, and then go ahead and declare your parameters in here. Now, another thing to note is, let's say we had, what have I got here? I've got a Boolean for deploy storage, but if I try and set that to a string, for example, by putting it in single quotes, again, it's doing that real-time validation against the bicep file. And it says here that deploy storage expects a value of type bool, but the provided value is of type false, which is actually a string. So again, as you author these bicep param files, you get that real-time validation that we've been used to with bicep as we move forward here. Now, before I go ahead and do deployments, which we'll do in just a second, I want to show you a few other ways that you can go ahead and create bicep param files. So what I'll do is, actually, let's get rid of this file because we're not going to need that anymore. So I'll do a delete there. Now, there's a few different ways that you can generate the bicep param files. In VS Code here, I can just right click on this deploy environment.bicep file, and there's an option right here to generate parameters file right from the menu. So I'll go ahead and select that. And at the top here, it now says to please select the output format. So previously, this would just default to creating a JSON-based parameter file, which you can see here at the top. But now we've got an option to create a bicep param file. And then when I choose that, it says, hey, which parameters do you want to include in the parameters file? Do you want just the required parameters, so those that don't have a default value in the bicep, or do you want all of them? So let's go ahead for this one and we'll choose all. And in the log there, we can see that it's generated the parameters file successfully. I'll go ahead and get rid of that. And you can see here that it's filled out the using statement against the bicep file that we generated it from. And it's gone ahead and put those parameters in, as we said all of them, not just the required ones. And it's gone ahead and populated some of the default values as well from that bicep file. So that is how we can generate it using Visual Studio Code. And you'll notice here, it's just named it the same as the bicep file, obviously just with the bicep param extension rather than .bicep. Let me go ahead and I'm going to delete that for now. And if we jump across, if I just bring up the terminal actually, and let's get rid of the file explorer there on the left-hand side and clear the screen. We can also generate the bicep param file using the Azure Bicep CLI. So if I paste in here, the command here is bicep generate -params, which we've always been able to use, but it's only previously done JSON files, -- file, and I'm giving it the path to my bicep file, and then -- output -format at the end there is the important thing, and I'm telling it that this is a bicep param file. So if I go ahead and press enter on that, it tells me -- file is not recognized, and I think with bicep, it actually just wants the path there. So I'll take out -- file. That looks a little bit better. If I go to Explorer here, we can see again, we've got a bicep param file. It is got the using statement in there because we told it which bicep file to associate with. And we've got just the location and deploy storage. So note that we don't have all of the parameters here. Now let me go ahead and close that down. Back down here, there is another switch or argument that we can put here, which is, as you can see, I've gone through this already, -- include -params. And you can tell it here to include all parameters, or you could also just set this to required, but that is the default behavior, as you just saw, was to do just required. But if I go ahead and set that to all, and then we go back into Explorer, you'll notice now we've got the other additional parameters there that weren't in there when it was just generating the required ones. So like I said at the start of this video as well, if I clear the screen there, I'm just going to up arrow to bring that back because you can use the Azure CLI, and there's a bicep component within the Azure CLI to use the command line interface for bicep as well. But like I said, if I press enter on that, actually I think that one is going to want the -- file path. So let me put -- file back in there. Slight differentiation there between the Azure CLI and Bicep CLI itself. You'll notice here that it does indeed say at the moment, there are unrecognized arguments for the output format and the include params. And that's because just as of right now, when I'm recording this video, the Azure CLI hasn't been updated to know about those new arguments yet. So if you're going to be using it right now with the CLI, you probably just need to use the Bicep CLI. I'm sure in a couple of weeks' time that the team will have updated the Azure CLI to have those arguments known in there as well, and you'll be able to use the Azure CLI to perform these command line level tasks as well. So let me clear the screen there and let's get rid of the terminal. So this is how to generate a Bicep parameter file from scratch, but as per normal Bicep itself, you can also convert a JSON-based parameter file across to a Bicep param file. So let me go ahead and delete this Bicep param file. And I'm going to go ahead and generate a parameters file, but I'm going to do a JSON-based one with all of the parameters in here. And that's interesting. It hasn't pulled all of the parameters in, but that's okay. Let me put a value in here for location, which can be Australia East. And we've got deploy storage, which was false. What else did we have? If I go back to deploy environment, we've got environment code, which I'll grab. Environment code. And we will set that in here to dev. And I know there's another one for tags, but let's just leave it at that for now. So I've now got a parameters file, which is JSON format, which is the older format that we used to use a lot with ARM templates and Bicep up until now. And if I've got all of these parameter files throughout my environment that I'm using already with Bicep, I can just go ahead and convert these to a Bicep param file. So again, right here in Visual Studio Code, I can right click on the JSON file and you'll see right down the bottom here, there's a decompile into Bicep params. So if I go ahead and select that, it will ask me if I've got an existing Bicep param file that I want to point this towards. Actually, that's interesting. I think that's a bug in the user interface. It's saying here to select a parameter file, but I think this is actually saying select which Bicep file to associate that with. Let's check out something here. Let me set this to none and we'll see what happens. So I've set that to none, and here I've got a Bicep param file. So let's open that up. And yeah, so at the top there on line 1, you'll see that it hasn't filled out a Bicep file in the using statement. And it's telling me in the comment there to provide a path to a Bicep template. So in there, I could go ahead and associate this manually with the deploy environment.bicep, and then this file becomes happy. And you'll notice the parameters there have been decompiled from the JSON file into the Bicep param file. But interestingly enough, like I said, I think that was a bug in the user interface. Let me go ahead and delete the Bicep param file. And I'm going to go ahead and decompile into Bicep params again. But this time I'm going to browse, and I'm going to browse to the .bicep file. And I'm expecting this time that it's actually going to put that in the using statement at the top here, which indeed it has. We've now got using pointing to the right Bicep file. So I think the wording there in the user interface was just a little bit off. But that is taking an existing JSON-based parameter file and decompiling it straight into a Bicep param file. Let me go ahead and delete that again, because down here, if I go ahead and get rid of Explorer on the left-hand side and go back to my PowerShell terminal, you can also do this with the command line interface. And the command to do that is bicep decompile -params. And then you provide a path to the JSON-based file that you want to decompile. And then you say --bicep -file and pass the Bicep file that you're associating it with. So if I press enter on that, we can see there that a warning at the moment that a decompilation is a best effort process, and there's no guaranteed mapping from ARM JSON to Bicep. That's all well and good though. If we check out our Bicep param file, again, we can see that it is got the using statement, it's filled out the right Bicep file, and it's carried across the parameters that I had in the JSON file along with their values as well. So if you've got existing parameter files throughout your environment that are JSON based, it's very, very easy to convert those across to Bicep param files. You don't have to go and create them from scratch or anything like that. So let me go ahead and close those down. And next up, I want to show you about this real-time validation as well. And you have kind of seen this in action, but right now we've got a parameters file here that is pointing at deploy-environment.bicep. So if I go back to this Bicep file, and let's just say if I scroll down and just put a new parameter here, doesn't matter what it is, I'll call it my new param, and we'll make that a string for now. Now, I haven't even saved this bicep file, and if you're paying attention, you'll see up the top here that the bicep param file has gone red because it has now got an error. And if I go across to that file and then hover over deploy.environment, it's telling me that the following parameters are declared in the bicep file, but they're missing an assignment here in the bicep param file. So that is how good the real-time validation is. So I would go and create a new param here for my new param and then provide it a string value. And there we go. Everything is happy again. So from an authoring perspective, it's what we've been used to with Azure Bicep, right? It's real time. It's here in Visual Studio Code. And it means that we catch a lot more of those errors earlier on before we go ahead and push this into a Git repository and deploy with a pipeline or deploy it ourselves with Visual Studio Code or Azure CLI or one of the tools like that. Now, I do want to get onto deployments and show you that because actually it's not too exciting because there's not really that much different to show you than before. But before we do deployments, there's one other thing that I want to show you here in the bicep param file. So let's keep that one for now. That's all good. I'm going to go back and just delete my temporary parameter that I had there. So we're back to a good state here. We've got a deploy-environment bicep file and a bicep param file. Let's go ahead and delete the old JSON file that we don't need anymore. And I just wanted to show you that you can use some expressions in the bicep parameter files as well. So remember back a few minutes ago, or at the start of this video, I said that down here, I'd created a variable for the storage account name, and that was doing some string interpolation. So I've got st at the start there, and then I'm grabbing a unique string based off the subscription ID, and it's interpolating that together to create a storage account name, which is going to be unique. Now, what we can do is I'm going to create a new parameter here in the bicep file, and I'll call it storage account name. So it's going to conflict there for just a second. And we want this to be just a string. And down here, actually, I'm going to copy that because that can come in handy in a moment. And I'm going to just comment out the variable there. I won't go ahead and set a description or anything like that. If I jump back to the bicep parameters file, what we can do now is we've got a param and we need the storage account name. And this time when I do equals, I'm just going to paste in that expression from before. So in the expressions here, as of right now, you can use any of the functions that sit within the sys namespace of Bicep, and unique string is one of those things. Now, we can't do everything in here. So you'll see it's not happy with me trying to reference a subscription. And that's because a Bicep param file doesn't have any knowledge of a subscription. A Bicep file does because of where we're going to be running the deployment to, and that's generated and calculated at runtime. But to generate the parameter values themselves, the Bicep param file has no knowledge of that. So I can't use the subscription function there, but I can use the unique string function. So instead of it being a subscription ID there, I can just say, base this off a unique string, which is my unique string. So that still allows me to use functions here in the Bicep param file. And another one that I'll show you as well is with environment code. Actually, sorry, we have, with deploy storage. So at the moment that is set to false, but we can make this conditional. So if we do an if else in here, this is a standard if else condition syntax for Bicep, and it translates across to the Bicep param file as well. So we've got a condition and then a true value and a false value. So I'm going to set the condition to say environment code equals dev. Then the true value is going to be false because I don't want to deploy storage for the dev environment. But if the environment code is anything else, then I want this to be set to true. So you can see here that this is now going to read this param file this parameter value down here for environment code. And in this case, it is set to dev. So deploy storage is going to evaluate this time to false, which when it gets to my deploy environment Bicep down here, it's going to pass that through and not meet this condition. And therefore it is not going to deploy the storage account. So that is just one example or two examples right now of how you can start to use some functions and some conditions here in the bicep param file and kind of bring those out of your bicep files, if it makes sense, and surface them higher up in your bicep param files. So with all that said, let's actually do a deployment, right? Because this has been a lot of talk and not much show. So if I bring up my terminal here again at the bottom and clear the screen, I've gone ahead already and done an AZ login to connect with the Azure CLI to my Azure account, and I've done a connect-AZ account to connect with PowerShell as well. So I want to show you 3 ways to deploy the bicep file here with the bicep parameter file. We're going to do Azure CLI, Azure PowerShell, and Visual Studio Code. And like I said a few moments ago, this is going to be relatively boring because it's not that different than the JSON files that you've been working with in the past. So let's go ahead and we'll start with the Azure CLI. So the command here is AZ deployment. Actually, I think that needs to be a sub create because let me just go back there. AZ deployment sub create because my deployment needs to go to the subscription, not to a resource group. -f is the file that we're going to provide. So that's the bicep file, deploy-environment. And then we've got -p over there towards the right-hand side for specifying the bicep param file. Historically, that's where you would have specified the JSON file, but you can just now change that across for a bicep param file, and it knows how to handle that. And because this is a subscription deployment, at the end there, I do need to provide a location, which I'll set to Australia East. So first, let me make sure I save this bicep param file, and I'll press enter there and let it go ahead and do the deployment. And what have I done? I'm not specifying the right bicep param file because we went ahead and generated one with a different name. So there we go. So this one is deploy-environment.parameters.bicepparam. And I'll go ahead and press enter. And while it's doing that in the background over here in the Azure portal, I am logged into my Azure account. And remember, so the bicep file that I had was deploying a resource group and conditionally was deploying a storage account. Now we made it so that the value for true or false as to whether to deploy a storage account for dev is going to be false. So the only thing I'm expecting to see here in a few moments is a resource group to be deployed. Okay, that's finished up and the provisioning state is succeeded. So if I go ahead and do another refresh, there we go, rg-dev-001. And of course, the dev in the name there was being pulled in from the parameter file where we set the value for environment code. And if I go into that, I'm not expecting to see anything there. There are no resources, which is exactly what I expected for the dev environment. So let's go back into Visual Studio Code here. And what was next? So that's the Azure CLI. So let's go ahead and do it with Azure PowerShell. So this one, we need to use new-AZ subscription deployment because again, we're going to the subscription scope here. I need to provide it with a location, which is Australia East. The template file, sorry, I've actually pasted that in twice. Let me get rid of that. The template file is deploy-environment.bicep. And then we need to provide it with our parameter file, which we can see there. We've got -template parameter file. And in this case, because I have changed the name of it, let's just tab this out, was deploy-environment.parameters.bicepparam. Again, the newer versions of Azure CLI and the Azure PowerShell modules know how to deal with a bicep param file. You don't have to decompile it to JSON first or do anything like that. So these commands can now take a bicep file for the infrastructure as code itself and a bicep param file natively, use them to deploy to Azure, and you don't even need to really worry about the underlying decompiling or transpiling to JSON that's going on as it goes ahead and deploys into Azure. So I'm not expecting that to deploy anything different because we're using the same bicep file and the bicep parameters file. So if we give that just a minute or two, I'm sure that's going to come back with a success message. There we go, that's come back now. And if I scroll up a little bit, we can indeed see that the provisioning state there was succeeded. So that is all well and good. Now, the last way that I want to show you how to do a deployment here is using Visual Studio Code. And actually what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a new bicep param file. So I'm just going to rename this one here. And I'm going to call this one dev. So deploy-environment.dev.bicepparam. And I'm going to make a copy of that and rename this one to be prod. And so in the prod bicep param, we're going to set the environment code across to prod. And I'm not going to change anything else because that all looks pretty good. And this time, if I right click on the bicep file from here in Visual Studio Code, we've always been able to do this, but I can deploy a bicep file straight from Visual Studio Code. So that's the deployment name. I'll leave that as is for now. That's fine. That's the subscription that I need to go to. That's the location that I need to use because I'm doing that subscription-based deployment or the subscription scoped deployment. And here's where it asks me to select a parameter file. And again, previously, this is where I would just select a JSON file, but now I can choose a bicep param file. And I'm going to choose here deploy-environment.prod.bicepparam. So that's the prod file that we just used there a moment ago. Now that has gone off and started the deployment. We can see there that it says to view the deployment in the portal, we can go to this URL. Let's actually go ahead and bring that up here in the browser. And we can see the deployment started off and the resource group there is deploying rg-prod-001. And because this is a prod environment, I was now expecting that this deploy storage boolean will resolve to true because the environment code is prod. Therefore, the condition here being met is true, which would then tell it to go ahead and deploy the storage account. And we can also see that the storage account name there, if I just in there, that's the name of our storage account. And you can see that the unique string there has been generated based off the function that we were using in the bicep param file. So there we go. The deployment is complete. I'm sure if I go ahead and go across to the resource group and go to the resource there, inside of that resource group, we indeed do see the storage account. So that is a couple of examples of doing a deployment using the Azure CLI, the Microsoft PowerShell, Azure modules, and also from Visual Studio Code. So there's just a couple of things that I want to mention here as we wrap up. And the first one is around environment variables. And this is quite a cool feature for a couple of different use cases. So let me go ahead and get rid of the Explorer on the left-hand side there. What I want to show you is, let me just make this a little bit more condensed here. There's some functionality in the bicep param file that instead of defining the values here, either based on a condition or hard-coded, such as location is hard-coded here in this bicep param file to Australia East, and my environment code here is hard-coded to prod. There's functionality that Microsoft or the Bicep team have put in the bicep param file to allow you to read in an environment variable instead of hard coding a value here in the bicep param file. So instead of the environment code here being prod, I could instead take that out. And if I start to type it out, we can get the Intellisense here for read environment variable. And it is expecting me to pass in the name of an environment variable that would exist on the system that is deploying this bicep file. So if I went ahead and put in some string there, and then I said env code, I don't have an environment variable right now called env code. So it's telling me that it's failing to evaluate that because that environment variable does not exist. But think about if I was deploying my infrastructure as code using Bicep on something like a GitHub Actions runner or an Azure DevOps runner or some sort of pipeline. And a lot of people prefer or have systems in processes that read in environment variables or generate environment variables when the pipeline starts for a lot of these different things. So my pipeline might be doing a deployment of infrastructure as code. It might be doing a release of an application into some of that infrastructure. It might be doing many things. So within the pipeline itself, I might set an environment variable called env code set to dev, test, or prod. And then instead of me having to code it in here to the bicep param file, I can just use that functionality there using the read environment variable function to read that in at compile time and make that the value of that parameter. So hopefully that makes sense. I thought that was a really good use case, especially for things like pipelines, and it can potentially allow your Bicep param files to be a little bit more flexible as well. I've seen a lot of scenarios with the JSON-based files where people will have a kind of generic, sorry, I was about to say Bicep param. They will have a kind of generic JSON file for a parameters file, and then in a pipeline, they will have a find and replace task effectively. So you'll have some default values there in the JSON file, but then there'll be a task before the infrastructure as code deployment that goes and replaces the values in that parameter file based off of environment variables. So this just kind of skips over needing to do some of that and provides a bit more flexibility here to the Bicep param file. So I'll go ahead and set that back there to prod. But that is how to read an environment variable in. And I'm sure over time, we're actually going to see a lot more functionality like that brought here into the Bicep param file. Now, the last thing that I just wanted to not really show you, but just make you aware of as of right now, and this is probably about to change, is key vault references with parameter files. What I want to do first though is generate a parameters file and a JSON one, and it doesn't matter here too much. I'll just do the required only, that's fine. And back in my Bicep file, I'm just going to create a new parameter here. Let's call it admin password. Let's pretend I needed a password to pass through to create a virtual machine or something like that. And I would set that to being a secure string because we don't want that surfaced in any deployment logs or pipelines or anything like that. So I'll save my parameter file. And if I come across here to the Bicep param file, it's telling me I don't have that defined, which is all well and good. Actually, sorry, I wanted to go to the JSON file. Let me go ahead and delete these Bicep param files for now because we'll generate those again in just a moment. Now, normally what I could do here, I'm just going to copy this in. In JSON syntax, we could create a key vault reference. So the parameter here was admin password, and then I'm doing a reference to a key vault. So we would typically provide an ID to the specific key vault where our secret's held, and then the name of the secret here. You know, that might be admin password or whatever, doesn't matter too much. So then what would happen is when you go ahead and use this JSON file as your parameter file to deploy your infrastructure as code, as long as wherever you're deploying that from, if it's a pipeline, then it's the service principal. If it's me here in Visual Studio Code, it would be my account, just needs access to get the secret from that target key vault. And then Azure Resource Manager itself will go ahead and retrieve the value out of key vault and then go and perform the deployment. Now, if I go ahead and save this JSON file, this functionality right here isn't in Bicep param just yet. And I imagine it is super close, and I'll show you why in just a moment. But if I right clicked on this JSON file now and decompiled that into Bicep params, and I'll point it to our deploy environment Bicep file. Oh, there's no value there for location. Sorry, let me just fix that up. So in location, we need to put value, and I'll put that as Australia East. So let's save that. And we'll do that again. Right click, decompile into Bicep params, point it towards my Bicep file, and there we go. So I've now got the Bicep param file, but if I go ahead and open that up, you'll see down here that there's just got a question mark for the admin password. And it says down here in a comment that key vault references are not supported in Bicep parameters files. So that is a restriction as of right now, but I dare say, I'm just going to open up the web browser here. There is an open issue in the Azure Bicep GitHub repository for support for key vault secrets. And the team here are aiming to use this function here called get secret and then a couple of brackets. So if I scroll down to one of the examples, I think they've got examples here. Yep, just down here. Let me try and zoom in a little bit. This is going to get a little bit warped, sorry. But this is an example right here of where it is a parameters file, a Bicep param file. And you can see down here, it's got param SQL password, and then it's using a get secret function. And you would then provide the subscription ID, resource group name, key vault name and the secret name, and optionally the secret version. And that would allow you then to define that in the Bicep param file to go ahead and retrieve key vault secret values when you're deploying your infrastructure as code. But as of right now, that isn't yet available. But the reason I say that it's so close is because it looks like that this has actually been linked to a pull request. So I imagine that this is coming out in a dot release, probably in the next couple of weeks. I imagine as of right now, it's middle of June 2023. By the time you're watching this functionality may actually be there. And across here in your Bicep param file, you might be able to use that get secret function and then go ahead and define the subscription and the resource group and the name of the key vault that you want to get the secret from. Now, a quick workaround to that as of right now, if you're deploying your infrastructure as code using a pipeline, you might be able to use the read environment variable that we used before and say that's admin password. And then in your pipeline earlier on, you could do a task that's going and getting secrets out of key vault and setting them as environment variables. So then this would read in the environment variable securely, pass it through to the Bicep deployment, and go ahead with the deployment. But as of right now, that functionality isn't available. I did just want to call that out. But with that said, that's pretty much it. I'm sure there's a few other nooks and crannies of Bicep param files, but that is the main stuff. So we've gone through what Bicep param files are, what the requirements are, how to create them from scratch, using the Bicep CLI, using Visual Studio Code, and then we went through deployments using the Azure CLI, Azure PowerShell, and Visual Studio Code. So with that, that's pretty much all I've got for you. The only other reference that I'll leave you with, which is all down below in the links, by the way, is there is an issue here, again on the GitHub for Bicep, called Bicep Parameters Upcoming Features. And if you go through this, it will have the user stories around what they want to be able to do with the Bicep the Bicep parameter files, and what some of the upcoming features are. And there's some things here that need feedback and investigation that they're still working on. So if you haven't seen some of the work that the Bicep team have done before, it is developed pretty much all out in the open. There are community calls every month. Again, I'll link to some of those below where you can see them. You can jump on, talk to the Bicep team, give feedback. You can do it here on GitHub. They are very much about asking the community and getting guidance from the community and showing features. And they'll say, hey, here's what we're thinking. Is that going to work for you? Or do you have other scenarios that we need to account for or think about? So come here into GitHub, have a look specifically at this one. It will show some of the features around Bicep param files, but just in general with the Azure Bicep development that's going on, the team are really awesome about involving the community. So with that said, that's all I've got for you. So go ahead and end this video. Go and find all of your JSON-based parameter files, convert them across to Bicep param files, maybe use some of the new functionality that's in there. And with that said, I hope this has been valuable for you. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next one.